them all what I'm made up. Strut down the hall, won't stop till I get enough.
Gaza. The headlines are just stark, on the brink of famine, and all eyes really are on the International Court of Justice now as these hearings unfold. It's impossible to ignore the weight of this.
Absolutely, and this isn't just, a localized issue. It really has profound implications across the humanitarian and legal landscapes globally.
So maybe let's try and get a clear picture of how we actually got here. Back in October 2023, the Hamas attacks, they tragically led to the deaths of around 1,200 people in Israel and the capture of roughly 250 hostages.
Mm-hmm.
Israel's response was, well, a significant military offensive. Then we saw that brief pause, the ceasefire in early 2025, which kind of felt like maybe a moment of relief.
Yeah, a bit of hope, perhaps.
But then in mid-March 2025, Israel imposed what's being described as a total blockade.
Right.
And by late April this year, the number of Gazans who had died had tragically reached, well, tens of thousands.
That timeline, it really just underscores the speed, doesn't it? The speed at which this humanitarian crisis has escalated.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the initial attacks and the response were devastating, obviously, but the imposition of that total blockade in March, that really was a major turning point.
Yeah.
It just accelerated the descent into the desperate situation we're seeing now.
And at the heart of this is a really, really difficult conflict, isn't it? You've got Israel stating this blockade is essential to pressure Hamas to release the hostages. But then the widespread criticism is that it's basically a form of collective punishment against the 2.3 million people living in Gaza. And the UN warnings of a full-scale famine really just highlight how serious the consequences are here.
It's a very sharp and painful collision, a collision between what Israel sees as its security needs and, well, the fundamental humanitarian rights of the civilians in Gaza.
So for this deep dive, our aim is really to understand what's happening on the ground, to try and grasp the sheer scale of this humanitarian crisis, and follow the unfolding legal arguments at the ICJ, all based on the information we've got.
Right.
So let's maybe start by looking at just how critical the situation for the people in Gaza has become.
Well, the most shocking aspect, I think, is the complete cutoff. The cutoff of essential supplies. Since March 2025, basically nothing, no food, no clean water, no fuel has been allowed into Gaza.
Nothing at all.
It's a total stop to the very basics needed for survival.
And the ripple effects of that are just devastating. We're seeing reports that all the UN World Food Program bakeries have had to shut down.
Yeah, completely run out of flour, other ingredients. Food reserves across Gaza are just, well, they're gone, exhausted.
This kind of scarcity just inevitably leads to dramatic price increases, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're hearing reports of a 500% surge. 500% in the cost of basic food items, which puts them entirely beyond reach for most families who were already struggling before the blockade.
It paints a picture of just absolute desperation. I mean, there are reports of Palestinian fishermen forced to eat turtle meat just to have something.
Yeah, think about that. Turtle meat.
And families bartering, whatever possessions they have left for just a bit of bread. It's almost unimaginable.
These are truly desperate measures. The kind of things you see when societies are facing the most severe famine conditions.
Yeah.
It just shows a complete breakdown of the normal ways people get food in Gaza.
And it's not just about the lack of food and water, is it? The medical situation sounds equally dire.
Oh, absolutely.
We're hearing basic medicines, even things like painkillers have run out.
Yeah, gone. Emergency rooms are overwhelmed, and tragically, people are reportedly, quote, dying quietly from illnesses, from injuries that would normally be easily treatable.
That combination of no medical supplies and this widespread malnutrition, it must be catastrophic.
It is. Minor injuries can quickly become fatal. And doctors, nurses, their ability to address even common things is just severely undermined. And we're also seeing more and more reports of acute malnutrition in children, which has long-lasting, irreversible health consequences.
It's truly what's been described as a slow-motion catastrophe. The images, infants, elderly people fainting from hunger, dehydration, it's just heartbreaking. And these makeshift soup kitchens, struggling to provide even a tiny amount of food, it really highlights how insufficient everything is right now.
That term, slow-motion catastrophe, it's accurate because it describes a crisis that is unfolding day by day, almost, imperceptibly in some ways, yet the severity is just escalating so rapidly with each day the blockade continues.
Yeah.
The cumulative effect of these shortages is just pushing the entire population towards the absolute edge.
Now, as this humanitarian crisis just gets worse and worse, the International Court of Justice in The Hague has become a real focal point. Can you help us understand the ICJ's role here?
Sure. So the ICJ, it's the main judicial body of the United Nations. And in this specific case, they held a 5-day hearing in late April 2025. This was requested by the UN General Assembly.
Okay.
And the request was for an advisory opinion on Israel's legal obligations regarding providing humanitarian aid to Gaza. Now, it's important to remember this is an advisory opinion.
Right, advisory, meaning?
Meaning, while it carries significant weight, moral authority, it's not legally binding in the same way a judgment in a case between two states would be.
Got it. Okay, so Palestine, with South Africa's support, presented their arguments. What was the core of their legal case?
Well, their central argument really rests on the idea that under international law, specifically the Forced Geneva Convention, Israel, as the occupying power in Gaza, has a clear, legally binding obligation.
An obligation to do what?
To ensure the welfare of the civilian population. And that includes facilitating the passage of essential humanitarian relief. They described Israel's actions, banning UNRWA, closing all the crossings for aid as unprecedented, and a direct violation of these international legal obligations. There was that quote from the Palestinian legal representative, something like, "This case is about Israel destroying the fundamentals of life in Palestine by blocking aid." That really captures their argument.
And that argument hinges on the idea that Israel is still the occupying power, legally speaking, despite the 2005 disengagement.
Exactly. That's the Palestinian argument, yes. That under international law, the occupation status continues, and with it come those responsibilities under the Fourth Geneva Convention for the civilian population's welfare.
Okay. And what was Israel's response to these, very serious allegations and to the hearings themselves?
Well, Israel chose not to send a delegation to present arguments orally during the hearings.
They didn't show up.
No, not in person. Instead, they submitted written arguments to the court, laying out their position. And before the hearings, some high-ranking Israeli officials had publicly called the proceedings a circus.
A circus? Wow.
Yeah, indicating, strong skepticism and basically rejecting the court's involvement in this.
That's a very strong reaction. What about the stance taken by the United States? That seemed to generate quite a bit of discussion.
It did, yeah. The U.S. position presented to the court was, let's say, somewhat nuanced.
How so?
Well, the U.S. acknowledged that Israel does have a general obligation to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza. But, they argued, this obligation doesn't necessarily mean Israel must work with specific aid groups, like UNRWA, if Israel believes it has credible security concerns about those groups. So the U.S. basically asserted that Israel has, quote, no legal requirement under international law to permit specific third-party aid groups if it feels there's a threat to its own security from their operations.
So kind of a conditional obligation from their perspective.
That's a good way to put it, yes. Conditional.
What about other countries? What were the reactions from others who presented arguments at the ICJ?
Well, the vast majority of other nations that spoke were strongly critical of Israel's actions and the blockade.
Like who?
Well, Russia, for instance, gave really stark warning about Gaza being on the brink of famine, millions facing existential despair. You had countries like Turkey, France, Iran, Indonesia, all explicitly calling on Israel to immediately reopen the border crossings for aid. And interestingly, Al Jazeera's correspondent covering it in The Hague noted that, apart from the U.S., every single other state that spoke condemned the siege.
Every other state except the U.S.
Yeah. It's quite striking, really, how the global response is kind of reinforcing those existing geopolitical lines, isn't it? Allies often focus on security, while others emphasize humanitarian law, maybe reflecting their own histories or regional interests.
That really does highlight the significant global divisions on this. You have governments aligned with Israel echoing these security concerns,
Right.
while on the other hand, a whole lot of other nations, Arab countries, European ones, Russia, China, are urgently demanding an end to the blockade and immediate aid delivery.
Precisely. And even among some of Israel's closest Western allies, we're seeing a bit of a divergence in public statements now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, countries like Germany, Britain, France, they've publicly stressed the urgent need for Israel to ensure unhindered access for food and medical supplies into Gaza. It suggests maybe a growing level of discomfort, even among historically strong supporters.
And it's not just government speaking out, is it? The humanitarian organizations, the ones actually on the ground witnessing this, they're issuing incredibly stark warnings, too.
Oh, absolutely. The president of the Palestine Red Crescent Society, Yunus al-Khatib, he went so far as to call for international sanctions on Israel.
Sanctions.
Yes, stating, and this is a direct quote, that Israel has left no space for humanity to live in Gaza. It's an incredibly powerful, damning statement.
Yeah, it is.
And of course, we've seen these widespread global protests, right? People in cities all over the world calling for action, for a ceasefire, for aid delivery.
Turning our attention back to the perspectives from within the region itself, what are we hearing from officials in Gaza and then from the Israeli government?
Well, officials within Gaza, they view this siege as a clear violation of international law. Some even call it a war crime. The legal team for the Palestinian Authority at the ICJ argued that Israel's tactics, this blockade, are fundamentally antithetical to a peace-loving state and a serious breach of the UN Charter.
So what are they asking the ICJ for?
They're appealing to the court to compel Israel to immediately lift the blockade and to fully cooperate with international aid agencies trying to get help to civilians.
And the official response from Jerusalem, from the Israeli government.
The official line from Israel, voiced by people like Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar, has been to stick to the idea that they already presented their arguments in writing to the ICJ.
Right.
And they keep criticizing the court proceedings as politically motivated, biased against Israel. The government consistently emphasizes what it calls its paramount security concerns and the nation's right to defend itself.
And the issue with UNRWA keeps coming up.
Yes, there's this persistent, deep distrust of UNRWA. Allegations of significant Hamas infiltration are often cited as the main reason for restricting aid going through that specific channel.
We've also heard reports about Prime Minister Netanyahu's government linking the reopening of Gaza's border crossings to very specific preconditions. Can you elaborate on those?
Yes, the Israeli government under Netanyahu has made it very clear any significant reopening of the crossings into Gaza depends on two key conditions.
Which are?
First, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still held by Hamas.
Okay.
And second, what they describe as the complete removal of any armed militants from aid convoys themselves. They seem concerned about weapons or other non-humanitarian goods being smuggled in.
So linking humanitarian access directly to security and political goals?
Exactly, which adds another layer of complexity to getting aid delivered in this already dire situation.
Stepping back again, thinking about the broader implications, let's look at the humanitarian and legal perspectives. The warnings from groups like the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, they've been incredibly stark.
Indeed, they have. The head of the ICRC spoke very movingly about the tragic deaths of numerous Red Cross volunteers in Gaza, emphasizing this should never become normalized.
Absolutely not.
And aid workers on the ground consistently highlight shortages of everything, absolutely everything essential. Clean water, electricity, basic medicines, adequate shelter for displaced people.
Yeah.
I read one report about a doctor having to make these impossible choices like who gets the last few doses of antibiotics. Those stories really bring home the human cost.
And the impact on children in Gaza is just particularly horrifying, isn't it? It raises such long-term concerns.
It's deeply, deeply distressing. That statistic cited at the ICJ hearings that Gaza now tragically has the largest cohort of child amputees in the world.
It's just devastating.
Unbelievable. And beyond the physical injuries, think about the profound psychological trauma being inflicted on an entire generation. It's likely irreversible. And the sheer number of children orphaned or who've suffered terrible injuries, it's just staggering.
And the various UN agencies operating there, they've been absolutely unequivocal in their warnings about the immediate risks, haven't they?
Yes, completely unequivocal. UN agencies have warned repeatedly, and with more urgency each time, of imminent famine gripping Gaza.
Famine.
And a full-scale public health disaster if sustained large-scale aid flow doesn't resume immediately. The forced closure of bakeries, vital food sources, the depletion of food stocks, it's pushed people to the absolute brink.
From a legal standpoint, it sounds like the UN's own top lawyer has a very strong view on the implications of Israel's actions.
Yes, UN legal counsel Eleanor Hammarskjöld's statement to the ICJ was very significant. She argued that Israel's actions restricting aid actually threatened the fundamental principles, the whole framework of the UN system itself. Her core point was that Israel, as a UN member state, can't just unilaterally disregard and effectively nullify the work and mandates of UN agencies without following established international procedures.
Right.
She emphasized that when this basic legal framework gets undermined like this, The UN's very ability to do its job, maintaining peace, addressing humanitarian crises, is seriously jeopardized.
And while this advisory opinion from the ICJ won't be strictly legally binding, as you said, it's certainly not without influence, right? So what kind of impact can it realistically have?
That's absolutely right. While advisory opinions don't have the same direct legal force as, say, a judgment in a dispute between states, they hold substantial political and moral weight internationally.
Because it's the UN's highest court.
Exactly. The ICJ is the top legal authority in the UN system. Its pronouncements on international law can really shape the conversation, the understanding of legal obligations.
So specifically here,
in this case, the ICJ's advisory opinion could exert considerable influence on future votes in the UN Security Council, maybe leading to resolutions or more diplomatic pressure.
okay.
It could also be referenced in arguments before other international courts, contributing to how international humanitarian law is interpreted and applied in conflicts and occupations going forward.
So looking ahead then, what are some of the potential next steps we might see? What are the key things observers will be watching for in the coming weeks, months?
Well, the ICJ's advisory opinion itself will likely take some time, probably several months, before it's formally issued.
Right.
But as we've already seen, just holding these public hearings, the arguments presented, that's already having a real impact on diplomatic talks and policy discussions, within the UN and in capitals worldwide.
So the big question is,
The crucial question now is whether sustained, concerted international pressure can ultimately compel Israel to allow a significant sustained increase in aid delivery into Gaza, perhaps under some kind of enhanced international monitoring to make sure it gets distributed effectively.
we've even seen reports suggesting President Biden has been directly urging the Israeli government to take more steps here.
Yes, there have been increasing reports of direct talks between President Biden and top Israeli leaders. The U.S. administration is reportedly urging Israel to significantly increase the flow of medicine and food into Gaza to ease the worsening conditions.
That sounds like maybe a shift.
It indicates a growing level of concern, and potentially a shift in approach at the highest levels in the U.S. government.
And there's also been talk about potential actions within the U.S. Congress, tying American aid to the humanitarian situation.
That's right. There are reports of some lawmakers in Congress actively considering attaching specific, possibly strict humanitarian conditions to future military aid packages or other financial assistance to Israel.
That would be significant.
It would. If those measures gain traction and get implemented, it would represent a potentially major shift in long-standing U.S. policy towards the region.
On maybe a more concerning note, there are also these reports circulating about potential future Israeli military actions down in the Rafah area, which is just packed with the displaced people right now.
Yeah, these reports are indeed deeply troubling. They're raising serious alarm bells internationally. The idea that Israel might be considering annexing territory around Rafah to create a military buffer zone.
Especially with so many people there.
Exactly. Rafah is currently the last refuge for well over 1 million displaced Gazan civilians. Any large-scale military operation in such a densely packed area carries an exceptionally high risk of massive civilian casualties.
And regional stability.
It could lead to further, potentially irreversible destabilization of an already incredibly fragile region. The international reaction to something like that would almost certainly be very, very strong, with major diplomatic fallout.
It certainly feels like the conflict in Gaza will remain a central and deeply troubling global issue for the foreseeable future. Observers will be watching so many things: ceasefire talks, shifts in foreign policy, the impact of those worldwide demonstrations calling for an end to the violence.
The situation is just incredibly dynamic. The convergence of this catastrophic humanitarian crisis, the ongoing legal proceedings, the complex web of politics and security concerns, it guarantees Gaza stays right at the top of the international agenda. As one advisor to the ICJ noted, the sheer urgency, the gravity of this, it just can't be overstated.
So to kind of summarize our deep dive today, we've looked at the absolutely devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza, a crisis really teetering on the brink of widespread famine, made so much worse by this near-total blockade. We've examined the deeply divided international response, a division really laid bare during those recent ICJ hearings.
Yeah, very clear.
And we've considered the highly uncertain future, with potential for more escalation and maybe significant shifts in diplomatic and political approaches.
Precisely. That complex interplay between the urgent human needs, the legal obligations under international law, and those deeply entrenched, often seemingly irreconcilable security concerns. It creates an incredibly volatile, challenging situation with just far-reaching consequences.
And that really leaves us with some difficult questions to think about, doesn't it? I mean, given the legal arguments we've heard, the undeniable humanitarian catastrophe unfolding, and these deeply entrenched positions, what fundamental shifts in approach might actually be necessary to move towards a resolution, one that truly addresses both legitimate security concerns and the absolute basic human needs of the people living in Gaza?
It's the core challenge.
Or maybe, thinking bigger, when we consider how interconnected global politics and these terrible humanitarian crises are, what responsibility do individual citizens, do international bodies truly have in trying to prevent situations like this from escalating to this point in the first place? Certainly a lot to think about.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're Bobby doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.